In this short video presentation, I will be summarising a recent paper titled A Qualitative Study Exploring Wellbeing and the Potential Impact of Work-Related Stress Among Commercial Airline Pilots. Although aviation is considered to be ultra-safe based on the risks posed to the travelling public, there is increasing evidence to suggest that aviation poses long-term health risks to pilots. Pilots can be thought of as both shift workers and remote workers, although not in the sense that has become common during the COVID pandemic. Pilots do not work from home, but they work remotely from the airports and cities in which they are based. There is an abundance of studies demonstrating that this type of work can be detrimental to the health of the general population, with increased risks of anxiety, depression, increased neuroticism and impaired cognitive function, reduction in quality and quantity of sleep, widespread complaints of fatigue, increased risk of adverse cardiovascular effects, possible increased risk of certain types of cancer, increased risk of type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome, possible increase in gastrointestinal effects, marital strain, family dysfunction and social marginalisation, and increased risk of fertility difficulties and pregnancy loss in females. The well-being of pilots, and in particular mental health, got a lot of attention following the 2015 German wings tragedy. EU regulations were introduced which required peer support programs, alcohol and intoxicant testing, and psychological testing of pilots. Unfortunately, this response was purely reactive and its focus purely on assessment and identification of current risk and had no preventative element to it. Aviation has traditionally managed risk through a combination of preventative and reactive measures. EASA to date have done absolutely nothing to try and understand why pilots develop mental health problems and how they may be prevented. There has been no root cause analysis, and surely prevention is better than a cure. Recent studies suggest that pilot health might be under threat from sources of work-related stress. In 2018, it was reported that 40% of pilots for a UK registered airline were experiencing moderate burnout. In 2016, just over 12% of pilots who were reported as meeting the threshold for moderate clinical depression, while 4% were having suicidal thoughts. In this same year, 17% of pilots felt that their employer cared about their well-being, while only 21% believed that fatigue was taken seriously by their airline. In 2012, it was demonstrated that workload was related to levels of common mental health disorders in pilots. These findings highlight that the well-being of pilots is an important issue and needs to be looked at. However, if better understood, there may be an option to implement preventative measures and improve pilot well-being. But to do this, we need to go beyond treating symptoms and dig deep and identify root causes. Although extensive research has detailed the impact of shift work, remote work and high cognitive demands on the well-being of the general population, there's been very little research conducted on commercial airline pilots. Although pilot fatigue has been widely studied, few if any studies have examined the broader idea of pilot well-being, and even fewer have given voice to the pilot experience. This presentation is part of the Lived Experience Wellbeing project, which aims to develop a broader perspective of the relationships between work-related stress, well-being, human performance, flight safety and occupational health and safety. Although this presentation deals exclusively with pilots, the focus of the project includes all safety-critical workers, such as cabin crew, air traffic controllers and maintenance engineers. The biopsychosocial model of well-being suggests that physical, mental and social health do not exist in isolation, but rather are three interdependent pillars of our well-being. According to this model, the cause, the manifestation and the outcome of wellness and disease are determined by a dynamic interaction between biological, psychological and social factors. None of these factors in isolation are sufficient to lead definitively to wellness or illness. Instead, there are interrelationships between all three pillars result in a given outcome, whether that be wellness or illness. Previously, Preliminary field research involved semi-structured informal interviews with 103 pilots, and all data collected was de-identified. The pilots' lived experience was explored, with sources of work-related stress being identified and the impact of these stressors on the physical, mental and social well-being of themselves and their families discussed. The data from these interviews was analysed and supported by a literary review. This led to the development of a preliminary biopsychosocial model of pilot well-being. A series of 3 workshops were held in Dublin Airport with 33 participants in total, all of whom flew for Irish registered airlines. The group included 20 captains and 13 first officers who had on average over 9,000 flying hours experience. 26 of them were male, 7 were female, 25 were on full-time contracts with 8 working part-time, 4 flew for a regional operator, while 26 flew short and medium haul, with the remaining 7 flying long haul. The workshops had 2 objectives. The first was to examine work-related stress and the specific work factors that impact the well-being of pilots. The second was to examine the relationships between work-related stress, pilot well-being, pilot performance and flight safety. However, this presentation will only look at the first objective. The feedback from the workshops was analysed in terms of sources of work-related stress, how these stressors affected pilots, in other words, how they manifested into symptoms, and finally the eventual health outcomes experienced by pilots. This data was then divided into 3 teams related to the 3 pillars of the biopsychosocial model, that being biological, psychological and social. Let's start with Team 1, which looks at the biological issues, consequences and causes. The workshop participants highlighted a range of biological issues that they identified as impacting them as a result of work and work-related stress. These issues were then divided into a number of subordinate teams. In the case of the biological pillar, these subordinate teams were fatigue, diet, hydration and bowel movements, back pain and musculoskeletal issues, and lack of physical exercise. On the right hand side of the screen are a series of infographics which visually depict the feedback from the pilots and display how sources of work-related stress can produce symptoms, which in some cases progress onto health outcomes. On the left hand side of the screen are direct, unedited quotes from workshop participants. I suggest that you pause after each slide, read the quotes and then reflect on the infographic. So let's begin with the first, fatigue. Workshop participants reported frequently feeling tired and sleep deprived due to working long, irregular, antisocial hours with frequent time zone changes and associated sleep displacement, deficit and disruption. This was normalised by many as a routine aspect of life as a pilot. Many consider themselves to be either early birds or night owls, feeling that they often worked against their body clock and that their sleep was disrupted. The pilot participants reported diet as a concern and either consumed crew meals provided by their airline or brought their own food, with many critical of the portion sizes of crew meals and suspicious of the nutritional content and processed nature. Those who self-catered reported frequent stress due to the issues with airport security. Participants reported regular snacking between meals, with meals normally consumed when opportunity allowed, for example during quieter periods of their duty, rather than when actually hungry. Many reported gastrointestinal issues such as irritable bowel syndrome, abdominal bloating, hemorrhoids, and some attributed this to their diet, disrupted toilet habits and sitting for long periods within the confines of the cockpit. Due to a reluctance to urinate regularly, dehydration was also reported as an issue. Numerous pilots reported a reluctance to have a bowel movement while on an aircraft, delaying defecation until after their shift, with reasons given such as disruption to the cabin crew, a lack of privacy, and also the perception of being monitored by their passengers. Reports of lower back pain were common among participants, as were complaints of poor ergonomics within the cockpit. Owing to the long working days and sedentary nature of the job, Many pilots reported taking little or no physical activity during their working week. Antisocial and irregular hours made regular exercise as part of teams and clubs difficult. Let us now examine Theme 2, which looks at psychological issues, consequences and causes. As with the previous theme, participants highlighted a range of psychological issues which were then subdivided into a number of subordinate themes, which were not feeling valued, diminishing authority and reducing support, social isolation, employment practices, and aeromedical requirements. Feeling not valued was an issue for pilots. Participants reported working longer duties with less rest time and for less remuneration. Overall, there was a sense that pilots were not valued as much as previously by their employers. The term glorified bus drivers was frequently used. Many participants, particularly more experienced crew, reported that levels of stress and responsibility have increased during the past 15 years, highlighting that new responsibilities have appeared due to commercial pressures. Some felt that the commander's authority and autonomy were diminishing. Pilots reported a lack of identity and personal space while at work. Unlike many other professions, they don't have their own desk space or workshop and have little or no way of displaying their own individuality. They also reported feeling that they were prevented in taking part in activities that many people who are not pilots use to de-stress, such as committing to regular activities as part of clubs or teams. The most frequently reported issues reported related to employment practices. As a result, this slide is split in two. Many pilots described a disconnection between their own values and those of their line managers, feeling that their employer cared little about their welfare. Some pilots reported feeling that occasionally safety, but more often staff well-being, was compromised in favour of commercial requirements. Participants reported not feeling psychologically safe in raising well-being related concerns with their managers. Fatigue risk management and work-life balance were considered to be company philosophies that had not made it into practice. Some pilots reported feeling psychologically drained, having spent years of working long, irregular and antisocial hours, in an environment where they felt undervalued. A number of pilots reported morale as a safety concern, while some saying that they found it difficult to remain motivated in maintaining their professionalism. Due to changing employment practices, many pilots are hired indirectly via agencies, with some not receiving payment if unable to fly due to sickness. Increasing numbers of pilots have substantial financial debt owing to the high initial training costs. This was reported as a deterrent in reporting sick and a cause of distress due to professional conflict. Some captains also reported this as a source of concern when flying with such pilots. In some cases, pilots reported feeling that calling in sick was not considered acceptable by their line managers or their base captains. The stringent aeromedical requirements considered by many to be a deterrent in openly discussing well-being issues, particularly those related to mental health. Due to the perception of pilots possessing the right stuff and having been cut from the same cloth as astronauts, pilots reported that if they developed mental health issues, they would most likely not discuss it with colleagues. Other pilots reported that owing to the perception of living the dream and a lack of support from those outside the profession, that they would be unlikely to disclose such an issue to an outsider. Now, let us move on to the final theme, which looks at social issues, consequences and causes. As with the previous two themes, a range of social issues were highlighted and then subdivided into the following subordinate themes: family strain, marriage relationship strain, lack of understanding from others, loneliness, home life isolation, and finally, macho culture. A strained home life, loneliness and poor social networks were reported by many pilots, and they associated these with working irregular and antisocial hours. Managing and navigating the home-work interface was perceived as challenging, and spousal relationships were sometimes reported as strained. Despite generous annual leave allocations, many participants reported difficulties getting leave during peak times, such as school holidays, and reported that important family events were frequently missed because of inflexible rosters. Delays were seen as a cause of strain, with spouses not confident that their pilot partners would be off duty as scheduled and able to take up their share of the domestic parental responsibilities. A lack of control over rosters and frequently working at weekends and holidays were highlighted as a source of family strain. It was felt, particularly in families where both parents were working, that domestic responsibilities were unequally shared. This was further exacerbated by the fact that pilots frequently spend nights away from base while spouses manage the family alone. Most pilots reported that their families and friends held unbalanced views of the challenges facing pilots, not fully appreciating the negative aspects of being a pilot and instead only focusing on the positives. As such, many felt that they did not receive appropriate understanding and support in dealing with well-being issues such as loneliness, stress or fatigue. With many pilots fulfilling a childhood dream, many reported that in the eyes of others they were living the dream. Two distinct types of loneliness were reported and appeared to be linked to the length of time spent working as a pilot and to the ages of their children. Those with younger children, and perhaps those who were younger themselves, reported loneliness born out of not being where they wanted to be, that is, with loved ones. The second group were older than the first, had worked as pilots for a longer period, typically had children in the teenage years or older. These pilots reported feeling distant from their families, with some feeling that they were just paying the bills, and were somewhat removed or isolated from their families. They felt this was due to their repeated absences over many years. Some pilots who were approaching retirement also expressed concern over how they would fit back into their family after retirement. Due to irregular, antisocial working hours, many reported difficulties in maintaining regular social routines and connections. Some spoke of social isolation and loneliness. Many spoke of hobbies that they enjoyed, but no longer did since becoming a pilot. Regular commitment to teams or societies was seen as very difficult. Many reported physical exercise was often solitary, for example, going to the gym, swimming, running, cycling. Pilots spoke of having to make a disproportionate effort in arranging events with friends, as the friends usually assumed they would be unavailable because of work commitments. Due to the ever-changing crew composition and lack of familiarity with fellow crew members, participants reported difficulties in forging close bonds with colleagues. This prevented them from knowing whether colleagues were having a good day or a bad day, and was seen as detrimental to building supportive work environments. Some captains described a sense of social isolation due to the often sizable age difference between themselves and the other crew members. This was exacerbated on duties involving night stops. Some participants, both captains and co-pilots, described a lack of peer support on a routine basis. Some pilots described the culture in which they worked as male-dominated and macho, that is, stable extroverts who were mentally resilient and calm under pressure. This was seen as feeding a culture in which pilots were considered to be immune from experiencing mental health issues. Peer support programs operate with a high degree of confidentiality, and consequently, participants expressed a view that if a pilot approached them, he or she is most likely unaware of how frequently the service is utilised, and therefore may fear that they are the only one to have ever approached the group. If the pilot is already feeling overwhelmed, this perception may further increase the feelings of isolation. The workshops with the pilots gave rich and varied data concerning issues of work-related stress and pilot well-being. It was noticeable how many of the pilots identified with issues of work-related stress and were concerned about their own long-term well-being. The breadth of issues discussed within the biopsychosocial model of pilot lived experience stands in stark contrast to a limited focus of pilot fatigue or suicidality, for instance. The model presented in this presentation highlights the need for a multidimensional approach to pilot well-being. The breadth of this conceptual framework highlights the range of different ways that pilot well-being is affected by their role. It offers a broad range of opportunities for intervention, and this conceptualization is much broader than often discussed and gives a range of areas to be explored for further research. The limitations of this study include the qualitative nature of small-scale workshops, potential bias due to the self-selected sample, and the fact that the workshops took place over 3 points in time. The sample composition is made of commercial pilots flying for airlines based in Ireland, and the study results need to be replicated in other cohorts of pilots and with large-scale quantitative research. Since completing these workshops, an online general health questionnaire was launched and incorporated the standard instruments used to measure levels of depression, suicidal ideation, and burnout used in the studies referred to earlier on in this presentation. This highly detailed questionnaire also examined lifestyle factors that are commonly accepted to impact on physical, mental and social well-being. Within the questionnaire, additional quantitative and qualitative research will be undertaken to further validate and develop the biopsychosocial model of pilot lived experience. It is hoped that the findings of this questionnaire will assist in furthering the understanding of what contributes to some pilots being susceptible to distress while others remain resilient. Until recently, absence of evidence suggesting that pilots were suffering was broadly taken as evidence of absence of no suffering. However, substantial evidence now demonstrates that pilots are under stress and experiencing well-being problems. Furthermore, evidence suggests aspects of their job are contributing to these health problems. Pilots are potentially more at risk of developing well-being issues than has previously been considered, despite the perception that pilots are naturally mentally resilient. Despite the extremely low number of lives lost to pilot suicide, there are arguably a significantly large number of pilots flying today with untreated mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Potentially, burnout and embitterment with work practices can lead to disengagement and loss of motivation. Disengagement, loss of motivation can have an impact on task performance and professionalism. This in turn has an impact on flight safety. If the well-being of pilots is being negatively affected by the nature of their work, this needs to be identified, it needs to be measured, and the associated risks need to be managed accordingly. The biopsychosocial model of the lived experience of a pilot, as presented in this presentation, provides a useful starting point for this research, and perhaps could be utilised in training pilots for 1. The identification of risky behaviour, and 2. The development of coping strategies. Both pilots and airlines are responsible for managing well-being issues. A first step is the identification of the challenges faced by pilots. If the true picture of pilot well-being, including the causes for well-being problems, were to emerge, this may well help reduce or even remove the current stigmatisation of mental health issues among pilots, thus enabling open disclosure and increased support. In time, perhaps airline management might reconsider their duty of care to their employees, and regulators may implement measures that not only protect the safety of the travelling public, but also the well-being of the crew operating the aircraft. Potentially, these findings can be used to identify and scope possible coping strategies for use by pilots to self-manage health and well-being issues associated with the job of being a pilot. To finish up, I'd like to thank the 103 pilots who took part in the preliminary field research and to the 33 pilots who partook in the workshops. I would also like to thank my colleagues and mentors, Dr. Joan Cahill and Associate Professor Keith Gaynor. And finally, I'd like to thank you for listening. Any queries can be directed directly to me at the following email. Thank you.